Welcome, everybody. It's so good that you're here. Thank you for coming. We're going to get started with our presentation in just a second. I'm going to try not to be overwhelming with my sound. I notice you're holding your ear. Just let me know if, yeah. Let me know if, just let me know if it's too loud. I won't speak too loudly. I wanted to get things started. And we're all here today. Well, we're all here because we care about what's happening in Lost Nation. But specifically, we're here today to hear from Dr. Kent Chamberlain. And I'd like to introduce him now, and we'll turn to his presentation, which I think you're going to find to be very interesting and informative. I looked at a short 20-minute presentation online a couple of days ago, and he's the real deal. What I mean by that is he's a real scientist, and the science he's going to be talking about isn't fake science at all. It's the real deal. So here we go. Dr. Chamberlain is the past chair and professor emeritus in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. He has received 2 Fulbright Awards. They don't just give those out. He has received 2 Fulbright Awards, including the prestigious Fulbright Distinguished Chair. He has also served as an associate editor for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and he regularly performs reviews for them and other technical and scientific publications. In other words, he's reviewing the work of other people for this publication. In his more than 40 years in academia, he has performed research for over 25 sponsors, including the Department of Justice, the U.S. Air Force, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the National Science Foundation, much of it involving the modeling and measurement of electromagnetic fields and the siting of communications and navigation antennas. Dr. Chamberlain served on the New Hampshire State Commission that was convened through bipartisan legislation to explore the impacts of wireless radiation. Since serving on the commission, he has been active in carrying out the recommendations of the commission by working with legislators and community groups around the world. Dr. Chamberlain serves as the vice chair for the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, which is an international group of renowned scientists with expertise in radiation and biological effects. He engaged in a speaking tour in Europe, where he presented the findings of the commission to groups that included the Royal Society of Medicine in London. He was also a part of a speaking tour in China, where he presented the findings of the commission in addition to new information that has been identified since the commission issued its final report. Dr. Chamberlain is also an author on the open access peer-reviewed article, Cell Phone Radiation Exposure Limits and Engineering Solutions, published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Our coordinator for this presentation, Pam Wallace, is Dr. Chamberlain's partner in Safe Technology Education. She is the Director of Education and Outreach for the Environmental Health Trust. She has been an educator for more than 35 years and has been working since 2011 with leading experts educating industries, the public, and policymakers at the state, local, and national levels on safer technology and helping to craft and implement the best practices that guide us forward in our safest use and relationship with technology. The real deal, as I said. Wow. So we're going to turn over the show, if you want to call it that, the presentation to Dr. Chamberlain and to Pam, who's been helping us as well the last couple of weeks. I'm going to turn my microphone down and turn their microphone up. So here we go.
Fantastic. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm getting a nod of the head from Lupin. Thank you so much. And thank you for that introduction. You know, it's good to be back here in New Hampshire. I really wish I could be with you there because I'm sitting here drinking tea and I imagine some of you will be drinking beer. And I think the choice is pretty obvious there, which one's the best. I am a New Hampshire guy. And this is only, I think, about the second or third time that I've presented in New Hampshire. As you heard from the introduction, I've presented a lot of other places, but not New Hampshire. So it's really good to be back with you. I was going to be there in person for an upcoming meeting, Planning Commission meeting, but that got called off. So now I'm going to present to you virtually, although, like I say, I wish I could be there. So the journey that brings me before you today started about 6 years ago when I agreed to serve on a state commission that was formed to talk about and to explore wireless radiation issues. And I'll say more about that in just a moment. But that's what brings me here. But it's also important to let you know that in the beginning, when I was still department chair, before I had served on the commission, I didn't think there was a problem with wireless radiation exposure. Oh, I knew you probably didn't want to have your phone up to your ear 24/7, but in all, I thought that the risk was very minor. Now, why I thought that is because I was reading trade publications that kept saying that, trying to promote that idea that wireless radiation is harmless. But then I served on the commission, and that's a lot of the information that I'll be sharing with you today, because as a result of that service on the commission, I did a total about face in my understanding and beliefs about wireless radiation exposure. So why don't I bring up my slides and start my presentation? And by the way, I'd like to keep this somewhat informal. I've got a lot of information to present, and I'm going to try to go through it and, give you the types of information that I feel you need, but I don't want to rush through it. But if I'm going too quickly, or you feel like I've skipped over something, please just shout out, and I'll be glad to, answer questions on the fly, and also slow down. So with having said that, I'd like to move into my slides. I'm
And Kent, may
assuming I
I
can.
break in just a minute
Oh,
and
but of course.
I'm going to greet everybody, and I want to
Oh,
let
I'm
you know.
sorry, Pam. I should have, my
No,
bad.
no, 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 that's no problem at all. And I'd also like to let you know there is going to be a Q&A at the end where we have just a much more dialogue orientation. So the beginning, Dr. Chamberlain shares his findings in the New Hampshire Commission and then we get into that dialogue portion. So if you have a question, we will have plenty of time for it in the end and to get a little bit more of a deep dive into things.
Thanks for pointing that out, Pam. So here are my slides, and assuming that you can see them now. Okay, I'm getting a head nod, so why don't I now just proceed with the slides and talk about what I'm going to talk about. And the first thing is to tell you what's going to be covered in this presentation. And the first, and I think one of the most important parts, is just to let you know that there was a commission, what is that we looked at, what was our charge, and what were our findings. So I'm going to do that because it's just key to this entire presentation. And then you need to know how the wireless guidelines were set, because if they're putting in a tower, the people who are promoting the tower will say, oh, well, you're only 1% or 2% or 5% of FCC limits. And you think, oh, that sounds pretty safe. That's not a problem. And I'll let you know, or I'll show you how those standards were come up with and what it really means to be at a percentage, a reasonable percentage of the FCC guidelines. And then the role of government. People are saying, hey, we have a government agency, the Federal Communications Commission. They're there to protect us. And so if they say it's okay, it's okay. So my question, which I'll be answering, is it okay? Are those standards really protective? And then specific information about wireless radiation harm. So I'm going to go through and take you through sufficient material so that when you're done seeing that material, you're going to have confidence that what I'm saying is true. It's not just we read a few articles and it said there was a problem. No, we did an in-depth study, which I'll be talking about, to come up with our conclusions. And I think that you'll feel pretty confident with those conclusions when I'm done. So what I'll be talking to about are questions that some of you posed already, and I've incorporated them into my presentation. And they relate to safety, property values, coverage, and that's wireless radiation coverage, industry motivation, and the Spectrum Act. What does that mean to you? So I hope that I will be able to address that with sufficient clarity that you'll walk away saying, okay, I got it, I understand that, and my question was answered. And then how to come up with safer and better engineering solutions. You don't just put in a new tower anytime anybody complains about coverage. There are lots of solutions. And that's something that I've studied in depth in my career, working for the various government agencies and agencies that were mentioned in my introduction. And then what can you do? Are you helpless to just simply accept what industry says or what they ask for? And the answer, as you can imagine, is no. So let's talk about the commission. And this is the one that I served on, and it started in fall of 2019. And the reason the commission was started, and I'm going to put the slides down for just a moment. The reason the commission was started is because legislators were being told by their constituents that they were being harmed by wireless radiation. And yet these same legislators were being told by industry that no, the wireless radiation is totally harmless. And in fact, you need to put more infrastructure in your state if you want to be economically competitive. So that's the origin for the commission that I served on. And I was asked to serve because of my background in radio frequency engineering and biomedical engineering. So continuing on with my notes, so the legislators, and I don't know how many of you are legislators or legislators, but you know that any legislator is dealing with lots of bills every year, like in some cases over 2,000 pieces of legislation per year. They don't have time to take a deep dive into this issue. So what the legislators did is they wrote legislation, and I have it linked here, and I'll be making these slides available to people. So if you click on that hyperlink, it'll take you to the actual legislation that formed the commission that I served on. So it was accepted, it got passed by both houses of the legislature, and it was signed by then Governor Sununu, and we then were able to convene the commission. And so the commission, we had 13 members, and 10 of us had really content background in fields relating to wireless radiation exposure. And specifically, we had 2 medical doctors, we had physicists, toxicologists, somebody in electromagnetics, that was me, epidemiology, biostatistics. And so we did feel like we had the expertise to provide the answers that were being sought. Also, we weren't being paid, except for the people from the telecom industry that we had on the commission to represent industry. None of us were paid for service on the commission. Of course, that's pretty typical for New Hampshire, right? Anybody or anything to do with the legislature, they don't pay you for it, but they oftentimes expect a lot. So what were some of the questions posed to us? And those questions were posed in the legislation itself. And I'll only mention a few of them. The first one is, okay, why does the insurance industry recognize wireless radiation as a risk, but they won't insure for damages? Not even Lloyd's of London. Well, that should be a real warning flag, and it was to the legislators. Well, why won't they insure it if it's so harmless, as the industry has told us? And why have the many hundreds of peer-reviewed studies showing harm from wireless radiation, why have those studies been totally ignored by the Federal Communications Commission? Now, there are more questions, but I think those were the key ones and gives you a sense of why the commission was formed. So we met for over a year, and here is what we looked at. I'm not going to drag you through the details, but I do think you need to know the highlights. So the first thing is we looked at peer-reviewed and commission-vetted publications. Now, there are a lot of peer-reviewed publications that aren't very good, and you can get a lot of faulty information from peer-reviewed publications, and that's why we instituted our own vetting process. And I was very much involved with that because of my experience as an associate editor, because of my work on promotion and tenure committees where you're evaluating publications that are not in your own field. And also, I worked with our college librarian, had a PhD in library sciences, and she worked with me to kind of vet the publications to make sure that we weren't using anything that could be considered junk science. And so all of the information that we used to draw our conclusions were from high-quality publications. We also invited the regulatory agencies to meet with us, the Federal Communications Commissions, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So these are the guys, these are the groups that set the standards for wireless radiation exposure. Now, the kicker on this one is that none of them came to meet with us. Here we are, a formal state commission, and they said, no, we're not going to come. We had email exchanges asking specific questions. They did not answer those questions. And in the final analysis, we didn't get anything as a result of our contacts with these government agencies. Now, at this point, you might say, well, you're listing that under sources of information for the commission. How can you do that if you didn't get any information from them? Well, simply the fact that they didn't provide any representation in our commission is information, isn't it? So what's going on there? That was kind of our first red flag that something's going on other than simply a government agency trying to protect us. So none of them met with us. They wouldn't provide answers. And also, we brought in outside experts. You know, there are a lot of people who have done in-depth work in this area, looking at the health effects of wireless radiation. So we brought some of them in. In fact, we brought 9 of them in. And all of them provided clear evidence that wireless radiation is harmful. And that is all but one. The one presenter who did not acknowledge those risks was the presenter brought in by telecom, and it was the only presenter that was paid to come and speak with us. Everybody else came on a volunteer basis. So that's another data point that says, maybe industry is not to be believed, and maybe they have alternative or ulterior motives for trying to put in additional infrastructure. And I think you'll see how we came to that conclusion. So the outcome of the peer-reviewed literature, like I say, I'm not going to drag you through it, but I will say we identified hundreds of top-tier publications that showed harm from low-level wireless radiation. Now, I say low-level. I got a couple of terms here. It means the type of exposure that you get from living near a cell tower, or from your own cell phone, or having a wireless router in your room. That's low-level wireless radiation exposure. And these publications showed that there can be harm from those levels of radiation. Now, also, we didn't have to look very hard. The vast majority of peer-reviewed publications do show the effects. And the reason I put these 2 bullet points up here is because when you listen to people from industry who are presenting to groups like you, they will say that the only peer-reviewed publications that show harm from wireless radiation are those that are cherry-picked from fringe journals. And these 2 bullet points suggest that that is absolutely untrue. It's not. We don't have to fringe pick anything or cherry pick anything, nor did these information come from fringe journals. So here's an example. That in the study of oxidative stress, and that seems to be one of the main mechanisms affecting wireless radiation, we know how it causes harm. I have an updated study I meant to use here. But in this case, he showed that with over 91% or over 90% of the studies showed that free radical oxidative damage does occur from low-level RFR, radio frequency radiation exposure, over 90%. So it's not like you have to cherry pick to find the evidence of this. And for those of you who have a medical background or just have studied this issue, realize that oxidative stress leads to free radicals. That's why we take our vitamin C and we eat blueberries, right? To lower our body's free radical load. Well, though having a high free radical load can lead to a host of diseases. And we have those diseases that's been shown to be related to on this next slide. And so what I have on this slide are hyperlinks. And so when you get the slides, you can click on any of the hyperlinks and it'll bring you to an article. Now, we probably could have, in some cases, hundreds of articles relating to something like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, certainly. And so, but I was only able to put in one link per disease listed. So, it seems like that this oxidative stress, that comes from wireless radiation exposure, can lead to some pretty horrible diseases. And I think that you'll agree that these diseases are on the increase and have been increasing rapidly in recent years. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But before I do, I think there's a slide that you might want to see because there may be a question, and that is, what is wireless radiation, the stuff I've been referring to? Well, it can come from cell phones, cell towers, wireless, Wi-Fi. Your laptop uses Wi-Fi if you're talking to a router with it, cordless phones. So all of these, or baby monitors too, throwing that out. These all create wireless radiation. And initially in the commission, we were looking at 5G, focusing on 5G, and we finally said, well, no, this effect, the effect of wireless radiation seems to span most of these wireless devices, but all of them. And so when I talk about wireless radiation, these are the devices I'm referring to. Now, let's take a step back. And I showed you on the last slide that the diseases that were associated with wireless radiation exposure. And so if wireless radiation exposure leads to those diseases, wouldn't we expect to see an increase in those diseases over time, like the last 10, 15 years, 20 years? And the answer is yes. So what I'm about to show you is the temporal prevalence of these diseases, some of the diseases I mentioned on the previous slide, over time. And so let's go to that and let's look at Alzheimer's deaths. And that's just from 2000 to 2020. And the trend is continuing. So what you'll see from this slide is Alzheimer's deaths per 100,000 people has doubled, more than doubled since 2000. Okay, well, that's kind of one data set. And it looks like, yeah, there's something that's increasing. By the way, I did not come up with these data myself. I went to and I have a link here that you can click on. It's from the Alzheimer's organization. This is data that came from them. I'm not showing you any of my own data. I'm showing you data that any of you can access online. So maybe it's just that we're better at detecting Alzheimer's. Maybe that's the excuse or the reason that we're seeing this significant increase. Okay, what's another one? Let's look at diabetes. And so here we are in 2004. You can see the diabetes rate. It's still high, but it's not terribly high. I mean, that's in 2004. And then let's look forward to 2012. What you can see is what I think most of you intuitively know, and that is there's been a huge increase in diabetes. And I do have a plot that I didn't use here, but when you look at what happened in obesity, for example, between 2004 and 2012, it is not that significant an increase. That wouldn't explain it. So one thing that did happen between 2004 and 2012, well, that was in 2007, the iPhone came out. And so that's just, like I say, a data point, something to take into consideration. So when the iPhone came out, a lot more people were using their smartphones to access the internet, and they were doing it wirelessly. And then finally, you jump forward to 2019, and the rate has increased even more. Okay, so that's the second, set of data that shows that there has been an increase with these diseases that I said were associated with wireless radiation exposure. Okay, let's look at something else. Tumors. And there's a key point here, and that is this is from the Danish Cancer Registry, and it's on central nervous system and brain tumors. A point to make, which is really important, and that is not all brain tumors are cancerous. They're deadly, but they're not cancerous. And so if you take the non-cancerous tumors out, it looks like it hasn't increased that much. But when you include them, then you can see this significant increase, like a doubling of women's cancers in the central nervous system and brain tumors. Okay. Just another data point. It's and look here from 1995 to 2000, pretty level. And then around 2005, you start to see this precipitous increase in the number of brain tumors. Okay, just another data set that confirms this hypothesis that there is a correlation, I'll mention causation in just a moment, between exposures and the diseases that have been identified to be associated with wireless radiation. Look at this one. This was a kind of a surprising one for me, and that is Parkinson's disease. Look at that. How quickly it has taken off and around the time that wireless radiation exposure has increased. So, and I got this from the Lancet, no less. And so each of these, as I pointed out before, you'll get the slides. You can click on it, look at the data, come up with your own data. I always like to have people proofing what I'm doing. And I've had a lot of people look at this in the past, and nobody has found any problems with what I'm presenting. Okay, so I've shown you the diseases over a period of time. I've shown you the increase. Well, let's look at what's happened with radiation during that same rough time interval. Let's, in fact, I can look in the audience and see how many of you have gray hair and remember how you had to search back in 2004 for a network. You want to make a phone call, it wasn't that you could do it everywhere, but that's in 2004. And then when you go ahead to 2008, remember the iPhone came out in 2007, you can see this very big increase in wireless networks. And so, yep, it's definitely increasing. And with that increase in wireless networks, of course, your exposure is increasing as well. Jump ahead to 2012. Oh my gosh. If you're in any of the cities, you're going to get a strong signal. No problem about it. And if you go off into some of the hinterlands, you may have trouble getting a little reception. But then you go to 2019, not 2026, but 2019. Look at this map. So with these maps and with the data that I've just shown you, you can see that there's a clear correlation between exposure and many diseases that are afflicting our country right now. So the question that I need to answer is, I recognize that correlation does not mean causation. So let me show you some data that make me believe that it is causation. In other words, exposure causes at least part of the increase in the diseases I just showed you. So here we go. Let's look at the wireless radiation effect on DNA. Now, what you're going to hear from people in industry as well, radiation from cell phones is non-ionizing. And there's a distinction between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. So what they'll claim is because cell phone radiation is non-ionizing, it can't harm you unless it's strong enough to warm you up. And that's simply not true. And here's an example of non-ionizing radiation. Did you know that UVA and UVB, radiation from the sun that we know causes cancer, that's non-ionizing? So when you hear this, it's non-ionizing radiation, it can't harm you. Well, that's simply not true. So here's a study that's really important. It's called the Reflex Report, and you can read it if you want. It's all linked there. And the reason I particularly like it, it was prepared by 12 different institutions. So you might get one institution that's a little bit flaky and they come up with erroneous results. But when you have 12 of them working together on a report from 7 different countries, you can have confidence in their results. So what they did is part of this study did what's called single-cell gel electrophoresis, also called a COMET assay. So if you take DNA and you run it through this COMET assay, and if nothing has affected it, you're going to get a nice symmetric figure at the end, image. Now, if you now expose that control to ionizing radiation like X-rays, it's not surprising. This is equivalent to 1,600 chest X-rays. You get the exact type of distortion that you would expect. But one thing is you get the same type of effect from exposing it to a cell phone. So 24 hours of mobile phone exposure gives you the same type of distortion to DNA as what you get from ionizing radiation. So to me, this is very convincing that there is an effect that non-ionizing radiation can cause problems to your DNA, can distort it. Now, there's something else, and this is research that I've been directly involved with, and it's referred to as blood rouleau. And it's generally in the past. In fact, I'm working with a radiologist, or Dr. Rob Brown, and he's been looking at the formation of blood rouleau, and he's been using ultrasound to do it. Now, this is a report, the fact that blood will, and I'll talk more about what blood rouleau is in just a second, but it was first identified by a woman named Beverly Rubik, Dr. Beverly Rubik, who's worked a lot in this area, and she found through looking at people's blood after, a finger prick, and found that their blood would go into rouleau as a result of exposure to wireless radiation, a router in particular. And it was followed up by a Dr. Magda Havas, who found the same things. They published their results, but they never got traction with their research because the studies of blood were done in vitro. And the people were saying that, there's a lot of pressure to keep this research quiet. And I'll talk more about that later. But they were saying, the reviewers and some of the people in the industry were saying, well, no, blood, of course, will naturally coagulate, which is similar to rouleau after it gets out of the body. So they totally discounted that research. But then Rob Brown said, oh, well, let's use ultrasound so we can do in vivo, in the body measurements, and that's not going to get shot down, and it hasn't been shot down. So here's what normal blood cells look like. This is just one view. It's a dark field microscopy. And the reason blood cells, RBCs, stay away from each other, they don't clump normally, is because they have charges on them. And just like balloons that are charged up, they will keep away from each other because of electrostatic repulsion. And so that was what you expect to have happen, what you want to have happen in blood. But if you come up with a pathological condition like rouleau, in this case, after being exposed to a cordless phone, you see a clumping of blood cells. It's obviously not a good thing. Now, as I started to mention a moment ago, 10, 15 years ago, this was very rare to see blood rouleau in people. And it was associated with chronic illnesses like cancer, like blood cancers in particular, chronic infections, connective tissue disorders. And so that was the only time that a radiologist would see rouleau in the blood. But now we're seeing it in lots of people, and I'll mention more about that in just a moment. But I think you can see why you don't want to have your blood in rouleau, because what I'm showing right here, the clumping together, does not go through capillaries very easily. And so that's why you don't want to have your blood in rouleau. But the fact is that cell phone radiation and other wireless radiation is causing rouleau to form. So let me show you what that looks like. And I, again, don't want to take much time, but I think you need to see the science. And now I'm the one that's been involved in creating that science. I'm doing studies. We're going to be going to Pittsburgh next week to collect more data. But here's what the data look like. So this is the popliteal vein, which is right behind your knee. And this is before exposure. And you can see there's nothing that's evident in the vein. This is the vein. I don't know, can you see my cursor? So here's the vein. You can see it's pumping blood, and there's nothing in the vein. And because there's nothing in the vein that would reflect the acoustic energy, it shows up as being what they call anechoic, black. There's nothing there. Now, I know that you're in a room where you probably can't see the screen very well, so this may not be as obvious to you. But if you can look in this area right here, you can see a little cloudiness. And that little cloudiness is the rouleau formation, and it is reflecting the ultrasound signal back. So this is a significant case of rouleau. And like I say, if you're just looking at the screen from far away, it's not that obvious, but you can see the rouleau formations swirling around. So this is important. It's significant because it is a clear biomarker of radiation exposure, which has been something that's been missing. I can talk all day on this, but I'll spare you. But the takeaway right here, and actually there is a takeaway, and that is, as I just mentioned from the previous slide, this is a rare condition, rouleau. And before, some radiologists had never really seen it before because they hadn't dealt with patients having those pathologies. Now, in this study that we're doing with Dr. Rob Brown, we're seeing about half the people coming in off the street already in rouleau. And it's a very big concern. So I could answer more questions if people have them, but right now I'll just pop on to the next slide. And that is that more and more physicians are recognizing the harms of wireless radiation. So if I'm speaking to a physician out there, some of you know already, and you're really active in identifying it in your patients, because a lot of the symptoms the patients would come in with, insomnia, inflammation, chronic inflammation, nausea. There's a whole list of symptoms associated with exposure to wireless radiation. So if you are a physician and you're not familiar, I can put you in touch with physicians groups that have educational material available so you can identify it in your your patients, and help them with it. Not going into detail about this, but just this is an example, and it's back from 2020. And there have 3,500 signatures. I'm going to update this because it's far more now. The number of physicians concerned about this issue has increased rapidly in recent years. Now, okay, the next slide is perhaps the most important, and it involves with how the FCC standards for exposure were set. And this is usually the part of my presentation that gets the most questions and the most aha moments. So let's go into that, how the current Federal Communications Commission wireless radiation exposure guidelines were set. Turns out they were set back in the 1980s and were based on short term. I want to emphasize that, an hour or less, 40 to 60 minutes, behavioral studies on 8 rats and 5 monkeys. Now, they've done more studies since then, but they didn't change the results because for reasons that may become obvious in just a moment. So what they were looking at and their assumption, and the reason that they were able to do these studies in an hour or less, is that they were assuming that only heating effects were a problem. Now, I think you all know from your microwave ovens that if you expose something, biological something, to microwave radiation, it'll warm up. And what the FCC was assuming on these studies is that if it doesn't warm you up, it's not a problem. It's not going to harm you. But we now know, they knew then that that wasn't the case. So the way they ran these studies, it kind of horrifies me every time I tell it, is they put the animals, the 8 rats, 5 monkeys, they did the animals separately, in an enclosure where they could expose them to wireless radiation. Now, the animals had been trained to push a lever to get food, and they were food deprived when they started this study. So as soon as they put the animals in the cage, the animals started pushing the levers to get food. And then they started cranking up the radiation, just cranking it. You can imagine like putting a rat into a microwave oven. And at some point, the animals could no longer press the lever to get more food. And the researchers declared that as being the threshold dose of radiation. Now, some of the monkeys had burns on their faces from that very high radiation. And of course, it was heat prostration that was getting them. So they finally heated to the point where they couldn't perform this very simple task. And the researchers said, okay, that's it. That's the limit. And then they took that threshold dose, divided it by a totally arbitrary safety factor, is what they called it, and applied that for your exposure 24/7. So it's kind of like they took a group of animals, like what if they took a group of people and they had said, okay, if you could smoke a pack of cigarettes in 1 hour and not die, we'll declare smoking to be safe. It's kind of equivalent to that. So it was this very short-term study, 40 to 60 minutes, and they said that they used that to set the standard for our 24/7, 365 exposure. The threshold, the safety factor, was totally arbitrary. Usually, when you set a safety factor, it's based upon a relative risk. Not at all. They didn't do that. So the reason I'm so horrified about the short-term study that was done and how the short-term study was used to determine our radiation exposure is let's look at something as we think of being as pretty robust, and that is a tree. So here's an example that a mast was put in, and this also gives you a sense of the type of exposure that causes harm and the time frame for that harm. It's not like you use your cell phone and you're going to keel over, not at all. So here we have a cell tower going in, and then 465 feet away from that cell tower is a tree. And back in 2008, the tree was just fine. No problem. But over time, the part of the tree that was exposed to radiation got sicker and sicker until finally, when you look at 2019, 11 years later, the tree had to be cut down. And that's the nature of wireless radiation exposure. It works on you kind of like smoking. Smoking doesn't kill you overnight, it kills you over time. And that's what wireless radiation does to you. And that's why we're so much on the rampage to keep these towers, cell towers, from going in next to schools. Now, in terms of what relates to the FCC standards, let's look at what's circled here in red. And if you'll notice here, the left side of the tree was 0.03% of the FCC limit. So when you're told that, oh, you're only 5% of the FCC limit, that doesn't mean anything for reasons that you saw on the previous slide, knowing how the standards were set. So, okay, that's what's going on. By the way, they did this study on hundreds of trees, and the study is available, and this was done in Europe. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, well, what is going on with the Federal Communications Commission? Why aren't they protecting us? I got one slide that shows that, and that is this report entitled Captured Agency: How the Federal Communications Commission is Dominated by the Industries It Presumably Regulates. Now, folks, I'm not getting this from a conspiracy website. I'm getting this from the Harvard University or the Harvard Center for Ethics. And it's a really good report. It's linked down there, and I suggest that you read it. And it's pretty well encapsulated by this sentence or this quote that I have there. Industry controls the FCC through a soup-to-nuts stranglehold that extends from its well-placed campaign spending in Congress through its control of the FCC's congressional oversight committees to its persistent agency lobbying. In other words, the FCC is captured. And this is a picture of a revolving door there on the slide, because what happens is you get somebody who's the head of the FCC, like Tom Wheeler, who then goes on to be the president of the CTIA, Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association. So it's a story that you've probably heard before. We've seen it numerous times in numerous industries, and that's what's going on, and that's why the FCC does not protect us. Now, the report goes on. It's a report worth reading. It's an easy read, and it's kind of terrifying in some sense. The whole thing is about money. You make sure that you have lots and lots of money to spread around for the lobbying and for giving campaign contributions. And so it's a playbook that's been used by the tobacco industry, asbestos industry, and an example of how that money is used is to put in advertising like this. I'm old enough to remember this ad. Well, ones like it. I don't know if it was exactly this one. Cigarettes do not cause cancer. Did you know that only 1 out of 6 lifetime smokers actually gets lung cancer? So if only 1 out of 6 people smokers get it, well, have we really proven that smoking causes lung cancer? Some people would claim not. So articles like this are simply intended to delay people's coming to the conclusion that smoking is harmless or is harmful, because the longer they can keep people guessing about this and make people think that there's a conflict going on in science, the longer the industry will continue making money from it. A classic example of predatory delay is how I could, if I were in person there, I would ask for a show of hands or people to call out and answer. How long did it take after it was discovered that asbestos caused this mesothelioma, a horrible form of cancer? How long did it take before they finally banned it? And the answer is 100 years. So it's called predatory delay. The longer you can keep people guessing about the outcomes of a particular toxin, the longer you can keep making money. And that's what this ad that you're looking at right now is all about. It was all about for cigarettes, and now it's about cell phones. By the way, there's a good movie that maybe you've heard of, one called Thank You for Smoking. Well, the people who had been advocates for smoking are now working for the cell industry, some of the very same people. So the conclusions reached by our commission, we have the final reports, 390 pages. I do not recommend sitting down and reading it, because you really can get the essence of it in the first 20 pages or so, but it has a lot of documentation that is useful, in the appendices. And the conclusion is, in a nutshell, wireless radiation poses a significant health to health and the environment. Period. That's it. And with also electromagnetic radiation syndrome, and that is, there are some people, I haven't talked about that yet, who have acute responses to radiation exposure to the point where they can't even be in the same room as a router or as even a working cell phone. I've met these people, the commission has met these people, and it's very, very real. So if you find that you have a response to exposure, then there are ways of addressing it to some degree that we maybe can talk about in Q&A. But importantly, this last conclusion is that this is not a solely scientific, matter of fact, it's not a scientific issue. The science is crystal clear. It's simply an economic issue and perhaps political, but it's not a scientific issue. The science is clear. So now I'm done with the New Hampshire Commission. I'd like to talk about some of the other considerations about wireless radiation exposure and cellular infrastructure. One thing that you probably know is that wireless infrastructure lowers property values. If you click on this link, it'll take you to a site that can give you letters or show you letters from realtors. Some of those letters are pretty strong, saying that you could have up to a 20 to 30% decline in property values if you're particularly close to a cell tower. But for almost everybody, if you have a home or property where you're within sight of the cell tower, it's going to lower your property values. And this infrastructure, a cell tower, it can pose a very big fire hazard. And so if you click on this link, you'll see examples throughout the country of cell towers that have caught fire. You can see how they're built and all that. You've all seen them. And they have like between 1 and 5,000 watts of power going into it. That's not insignificant. And they're made of electronics that can catch fire. So you should know that. And they also can fall over. Wireless radiation is harmful to wildlife. This is important in a state like New Hampshire. And it's something that we weighed on the New Hampshire Commission. It drives away wildlife, because wildlife is very sensitive to radiation, so it keeps them away. And also, it has a very negative impact on birds. I won't go into the detail here, but if you want to find out more about it, click on this link about wildlife. And also, I did work, as you heard in the introduction, for the Department of Justice, and part of my work was to show alternatives or ways of dealing with cell phone communication when the system becomes jammed. And that'll happen, as you notice with the second bullet down there. Wireless communication may not be reliable in an emergency. In fact, there are lots of cases, lots of examples where there's been an emergency and the cell phones were not available. And that's because what do you do when there's an emergency? You grab your cell phone. And so when that happens, it becomes useless as a communications tool. So it may not be reliable. And one of my jobs part of the research I did for the Department of Justice was look for alternative means of providing coverage, which I can talk a little bit about later. Also, wireless communications can be hacked or jammed far more easily than most people realize. If you will simply do an internet search on cell phone jammers, you'll be surprised. They're readily available. They're illegal, but they're readily available and at a pretty low price. And so you can, and there have been many examples, and the military knows about this, and they use jammers when they're about to go into an area. They turn off everybody's phones by jamming them, and then they were able to go in and know that people can't communicate with each other. So I could say a lot more about that, but I don't feel like I need to at this point. And this can easily be solved by staying with wired phones, which are disappearing because they're not as profitable as cell phones. This is all money driven, but I'm not going to go into more detail about that, at least not yet. Really, and here's a key point, which I will be talking about because it impacts a lot of you, is the negative impacts of wireless radiation can also be lessened by the proper placement of towers and the redesign of certain hardware, such as cell phones. And I've written or been a co-author on a paper that describes how to do that. So safety concerns. You hear, oh, we need it for security. That's not true. It's absolutely untrue. And I'll actually read this to you. While cell phones are in the first responders' communications toolkits, they are generally not the tool of choice. And I know this from my own personal work with first responders. Their first choice is a land mobile radio that operates in the VHF, UHF band that's lower frequency than cell phones and operate at higher power than cell phones. They can go up to like 110 watts. Compare that to your cell phone. So the VHF, UHF band is considerably lower in frequency than cell phones, and the lower frequency makes it easier for it to propagate. And that's one thing that I did in my own research was I verified that, where reception was and wasn't, and I provided the Department of Justice, with a propagation model. So next that about safety concerns is that the FirstNet, which some of you are probably familiar with, some of the work that I did ended up being useful in coming up with FirstNet, because what it does is that if you do now have these emergencies where everybody's using their cell phone, but if you call 911, or if you're a first responder, it gives you priority on the network, and you're going to be able to get your call through. Some of you who have been in very remote areas, and that's happened to me. My wife and I like to hike. So you go into some of these areas that are really in remote, and you'll note that you are able to, it has a display that says you can make, or I think it says SOS in most of this area. And if you dial 911, it'll put you right through. So this claim that you need a new cell tower for security and safety considerations, putting it bluntly, is bunk. I could have put it in more stronger terms. Well, I was also asked about the Spectrum Act. And so the Spectrum Act is important because it does impact the towers. And that is, is a federal telecommunications law primarily designed to streamline wireless infrastructure. Now, here's what's important to you, and that is local governments are legally required to approve any eligible request to modify, replace, or co-locate wireless equipment on an existing tower. Now, the reason people were concerned about this is they say, okay, if this tower goes in, can't they modify it and add things onto it? Well, the answer is yes. But that is a double-edged sword in the sense that it also allows other carriers to put their equipment on an existing tower. So you don't need to just plop down a new tower every time you need, where you feel like you need additional coverage. You can simply go to a carrier that is getting adequate coverage and say, okay, I'd like to add on and put my equipment on your tower. And that allows them, and the Spectrum Act allows them to increase their tower height by 10% so that additional infrastructure can be added. The bottom line, I'll probably say this again, is that any provider, any carrier has good coverage, then all carriers can get that same coverage by simply co-locating their antennas. You don't need an entirely new antenna. So, another thing that you're going to perhaps hear is because your claim is you don't need a cell tower in this area. And so they're going to say, well, why would we go through all this effort and all this expense to put in a new tower if we didn't need it? So here's the answer. I know the answer, call on me. And that is, telecom is trying to take over the home internet market. Now, most of us get our internet right now through wires. I do. I get fiber optics running to my home. But what telecom wants to do is they want to replace the wired connection with wireless. And I could give you lots and lots of reasons why that's a bad idea, including jamming, hacking, and exposure to radiation. And so that's what that's what this request for a new tower is all about. So and just to give you a sense of numbers, the home internet market is huge. $550 billion a year now. They're expecting it to go up to $850 billion. So that's what this is all about. That's why they're trying to put in new towers in places where there's already adequate coverage. I've dealt with this a lot. Don't need to go into it too much more. So I do want to give a little bit of comment about what is an adequate signal level? So industry is asking for, and I look at the report for your area. the Northumberland report by C Cubed consulting firm, and they're saying that they need to have this new tower, and they provide a propagation map that was which I can talk a lot about that too, but I hold off on it for right now. So industry is asking for far greater signal levels than it takes for a robust phone call. And we now know why they want to do it. They want to do it so they can be in the home internet market, but they're going to do it at your expense, your health, and also your security. So that's what industry is doing. And if you read their report, they're going to claim they need minus 85 dBm for good coverage. Now, I'm going to like to put that in perspective right now. That's a very, very strong signal, in my opinion. And by the way, as a radio frequency engineer with a PhD, I think I'm in a position to say, yeah, I know what it constitutes a good signal. And this is far greater than what you need for a good signal. But what they're doing, if you look at in the report that they've turned out, and I think you all have access to it, this is just part of their coverage map. And I wanted to show this part right here that it shows the color coding. And if you look closely there, probably most of you can't read it. Do I see people in the crowd squinting? Nah, a bit. But what they're saying is that you get green, indicating good coverage, if you're greater than minus 85 dBm. To me, as a radio frequency engineer, I go, that's ridiculous. You don't need that much signal. And they're saying that if you're minus 85 to minus 95, and I know that most of you aren't familiar with dBm, wouldn't expect you to be. This is in decibels, and so it's a logarithmic scale. But and I'll put that in a little bit of context shortly. But they're saying that if you're between minus 85 and minus 95, it's only yellow. But they're saying if you're less than minus 105, you're not getting any coverage at all. That's what I would take away from the color coding on this map. And I'm telling you, that's absolutely ridiculous, because during a recent power outage in my home, and by the way, I've looked at dBm my entire career. I'm very familiar with it, very comfortable with what it means. But I had a power outage at my home. I used my iPhone as a hotspot. Some of you are probably familiar with this. And so using my iPhone as a hotspot with my laptop. So that was my connection to the internet. I held an uninterrupted Zoom call for over an hour, uninterrupted, with a signal level of minus 110 dBm. Now, to put that in perspective, putting that in linear units, that's less than 1% of the minus 85 dBm signal that they're asking for. So this is something that they can be contested on. And I hope that you will do that. I just move on here. I got a few things to mention. And by the way, I'm getting close to the end. How are you guys doing? It's maybe a little bit late to be asking that question, but I hope you're doing okay. I've given you a lot of information. So alternative approaches to providing coverage. So let's assume that there are some gaps in coverage. That happens. You're living in would you consider a mountainous or simply hilly area? Mountainous, yeah. And so there are less intrusive ways to fill the gaps than putting in a brand new cell tower. And I've worked with these, and I've installed some of them. So you have what are called low power small cells. So if you have a kind of a small area where you have a gap in coverage, you put in a small cell. It's low power. It's not going to have some of the radiation issues associated with the large towers. It's not going to have the environmental impact. You're not going to have to remove so much soil and all that. There are also boosters. I put that in for my brother. He lived in an area where they had no coverage. And by using a booster with a directional antenna, I was able to get a strong, very good signal, and he can make Zoom calls no problem. There are also what are called distributed antenna systems that you can put in areas where there's a minimal coverage or a deficiency in coverage. And I'm just mentioning all of these, and I'm not giving you the details, but I can if you want to ask about it during the Q&A. And the other thing is what I had mentioned earlier involving the Spectrum Act, and that is that companies can piggyback on other carriers' towers. So this is the plus side of the Spectrum Act. So if any, and I'll just say it again, if any carrier is providing good coverage, then all carriers can do that by taking advantage of the Spectrum Act. They don't need to put in a new tower. They simply piggyback on somebody else's tower. no new tower, which is going to be great. Now, kind of as I'm wrapping up, trust me, folks, I'm wrapping up here. How to measure signal levels. Because I've mentioned it, I think that it would be very helpful for people to understand that what telecom is asking for in terms of signal level is ridiculous. So if you have an iPhone, you simply dial in, you can do it right now as you're sitting there, star 3001 pound sign 12345 pound star. And what that does is it brings you to a screen that shows you what I have circled in red here, and that's RSRP, which stands for Reference Signal Received Power, which is what you are getting, what is supposedly being plotted on these coverage maps. And so for people in your community to get familiar with actually making these measurements on their own, kind of like a crowdsourcing. And if you can show that there is sufficient coverage, then when they come in or when it comes time for a hearing, you can go before that hearing and say, no, we have completely adequate signal. And so that's one of my recommendations I'm going to give. Oh, by the way, Androids, you just look up, there are apps for Androids that display the RSRP directly. But as part of what you can do, I'm going to go beyond this, is determine where there is and isn't coverage in your area. Because if you're only getting a gap in coverage in a small area, you don't need a new tower. You can just put in a small cell or use some of the other approaches that I mentioned. So one thing that has been successful in other communities is people have gone to purported gap areas near where they're going to, or areas where industry claim there's a gap and where the industry wants to put a tower. And if people in the community go in there and they make a measurement, or they even just go in there and place a phone call, that goes a long way in front of a board. Because if you're going in and you have a signed affidavit, and that way it can be read into the record, and you just say, hey, these areas near the proposed tower, we have plenty of signal. That goes a long way, because you can imagine if you're on the commission and you hear your community members saying, no, we don't need the tower, we don't want the tower, we have great coverage in that area, it's going to affect their thoughts on it. I would hope, assuming that you have a level playing field, but we don't need to go into that. So the other thing is that work with your town council, your select board, your zoning board, to get ordinances in place to protect against towers. You don't, in most cases that I'm seeing nowadays, the proposed towers aren't really needed. And the only reason that the industry is pushing for those towers is that wireless home internet market. So that concludes my presentation. So maybe now it's time, Pam, I can turn it over to you, or just go for Q&A for both Pam and me. So at this point, I'll turn it over to you guys.
Okay, and you know what, Kent? You did a wonderful job covering it all. Guys, I'm the person sometimes that will pick up and say, oh, this piece didn't get included, but I'm going to say he did a wonderful job. The only thing that didn't get mentioned is, and because it wasn't on the slide, is that another source of wireless are utility smart meters. So water meters, electric
Oh, yeah.
meters, gas meters that people have on their homes, and they can, obviously they can have RF, and they also introduce power quality issues. So some of you may be familiar with people who've been against them or fought them, or to maintain their analog rights. So that's one of the reasons why they're included in this. But I think at this point, it's probably a great idea to hear from the audience. So Lupin and Joe, we will turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, I did that on purpose. All right, can you hear us now?
Are you loud and clear?
Yeah,
Okay,
you can
great.
hear us. Nancy, you can hear us?
We're gonna come back on the screen in just a moment. There we go.
Okay. Can you hear me, Pam and Kent?
Yeah, beautiful.
Oh, yeah, loud and clear.
There, okay, good. Wow. A lot of information. Amazing, isn't it?
They
Uh,
need to pause.
As well as some really good ideas about things we can do. So I'm sure some of you have questions. I have a question, but I'm going to let someone else who might have a question go first. Is there anyone else?
And
Okay.
Joe, can you have people speak into the computer so that they can hear?
Okay, so Tracy, you want to come up and ask your question to the computer?
Hey, computer. My question is, can you explain what you and others are doing to educate those in Washington, including New Hampshire state representatives, of the dangers of RF?
Oh, man. So yes, I do. So as soon as the commission was over, and like I say, it was over a year, we then focused on implementing some of the recommendations of the commission. So we worked with the legislators, we wrote legislation, and it was very reasonable legislation in my opinion. And there was enthusiastic response. Yeah, you served on this commission and now you're trying to implement the recommendations. Good for you. And so, like I said, we got initially a very positive response. It got a lot of people wanted to vote for it. But in the final analysis, it got shut down by industry. So we had and this has happened, I think, 3 times now, that we've put forward legislation that implements the recommendations of the New Hampshire Commission, and it got shot down. A lot of support, but what really matters is the people who run New Hampshire. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist like that, but there are people who are really running the show. And it's not the representatives, I don't think. That's been my experience. It's people in the Senate, and there are a handful of them. And if they say something's not going to happen because it's not good for industry, it won't happen. And they felt that the legislation we were proposing was not in the best interest of industry. Now, that's at the state level. It's even worse at the federal level. So yes, I have gone to and tried to make appointments with Maggie Hassan, who was on the security commission, with the cybersecurity. She was in chairing that commission. And I thought, oh yeah, she's going to definitely want to hear some of the things that I know based upon my work with the New Hampshire Commission and with the Department of Defense, Department of Justice. No, they don't want to meet with us. It's not what they do. It's not. It's as though they're not interested in. Oh gosh, when I'm taking a deep breath as I make this statement, but it's something that I think a lot of us know. They're interested in staying in office. They're interested in getting money, but they don't seem to be interested in working with people on safety issues, because safety is not sexy and it doesn't bring in any money. So that's my answer. So yes, we've made a lot of attempts to get in legislation. We've worked with legislators, both at the federal and state level, and to no avail. Where we've had luck is at the grassroots level. And perhaps you can speak to this too, Pam, that at the grassroots level, people look at an antenna going up on their kid's school and they go, oh, I'm not going to put up with this. I know it's harmful. That's where we get action. Or at least that's where we've gotten our greatest results so far. Not federal level, not state level, grassroots. That's where people seem to care. Pam, do you want to add to that?
I think that's a really complete answer. I do want to say, Tracy and others, that, there are some of the safe tech organizations do have people working on the ground in Washington. They're lobbying, similar to the telecommunications industry has more than 700 lobbyists at the federal level there every single day. So we're really dealing with a multi-trillion-dollar company with a vested interest and a business plan, and our legislators are not interested in legislating and regulating large economic driving engines. So what we're seeing, what Kent's pointing to in the community level, is things like cellular infrastructure, especially when it goes on schools. You're also seeing people now having conversations about data centers and other things where it's becoming very clear to communities that we're starting to really kind of reach a place with our bigger business on whose interests are going to win. And so at this point, lots of conversations at the community level about what's needed, what's not needed, and what we're going to, the level of right we're going to maintain in our communities. So these conversations are happening at the local, state, and federal level. But as Kent said, the largest impact so far, overwhelmingly across the country, has been at the local level at this point.
Notice she said what's needed and what's not needed. If it's not needed, it's not needed. Questions from others? Anyone else have a question for either Dr. Okay, Elizabeth.
To ask about the,
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask about the health, insurance thing you said, that the health insurance companies are denying people that live next to cell towers.
Well, it's just that they won't insure you against it. So if there's ever a company that says, "Oh, we have insurance against that," they're lying to you because their insurance companies recognize this as being another asbestos. But in this case, there are laws in place that keep the government from being liable. So the insurance industry says, we're not going to touch this. So you're not going to be able to get insurance. But do be careful because there are some providers or people that will come in trying to sell you on a cell tower and they'll claim that they have insurance. That should be a huge red flag for you because insurance companies won't insure against that.
And Kent, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. It's not the health insurance companies, it's insurance companies. So for instance, in school districts, if you look at their school policies, usually there'll be a disclaimer and an exemption for wireless. So these are things that are not really well known. They're considered to be a hazard. So if you were a business that wanted insurance against some sort of wireless exposure of your employee, there are things that exclude wireless. So you're not talking about against your health insurance, you're talking about other insurance. Now that in Florida, and there's some other states, that if you live close to a cell tower, that actually impedes your ability to get homeowners insurance, or it affects that. So there are insurance issues with this, but I think the bigger understanding is that it's considered a hazard to the extent that the larger insurers will not insure for wireless.
Yeah, thanks, Pam.
Mm-hmm. Is there anybody else? And you guys are muted, by the way, Joe. We can't hear you now.
Yeah, Lupin, we can't hear you.
There you
How
go.
about now?
Yes.
Oh, yes, we got you. Thank you.
Can you hear me if I speak into the microphone?
Yep,
Yes.
loud and clear.
One of our fallback strategies, if we have to accept that something's gonna happen, even if we want nothing to happen, is to have alternate sites. And to try to identify alternate sites that the applicant would have to consider. From a safety perspective, we obviously do not want a cell tower anywhere close to people's houses and their children. We would prefer to have a site that's already disturbed. In other words, it's not a pristine environmental spot. It's a place that's already had something happen in it. We'd be looking at the the power line. There's a high energy power line going through, yeah. Which might be considered. Dr. Chamberlain, would you consider that to be a better alternative than nothing at all?
So the answer is yes. And I'm glad you raised that issue because there are examples of using a power line tower to put antennas on wireless radio or wireless infrastructure. That's a great solution. Or it might be a great solution. Companies don't like doing that because where do they make their money but by building traditional towers? So they're going to fight it. They're going to claim, oh, we can't do that. They can in many instances, and there are plenty of examples of where that's been done.
Thank you very much. That's what I was hoping I had that you'd say. Other questions from anyone? Okay.
This is kind of local, but I saw a letter in the Global Chronicle today from, I forget who it was from, but it was pointing out that the current site is accidentally put on the wrong map lot, on the wrong lot, because Fortin owns 2 lots, and the test sites are on the wrong lot. So that was in the Global today.
If that is the case, then your lawyer, are you working with Bob and Zoe Berg on that?
Yes, we are.
So they'll jump over that on that with great vigor, because that would be if it's being proposed for the wrong place, that will be a legal issue. Pam, do you know anything about that?
Well, yes, but I also, that's actually what I wanted to point to. We didn't share, and I don't know how many of you in the room are very familiar with this issue. Certainly, Kent and I have been meeting with a team of you, but your town cannot deny this cell tower based on health and safety issues. They can know about them and they're legally allowed to know about them, but they're not able to make their decision on the tower based on health and safety because that was included in the Telecommunications Act. So one of the things to know that many of the industries that come in and have some of these harmful attributes, they often preempt or they get laws in place that take away their liability, but also make it so that it controls our ability to regulate them at the local level. So one of the constraints they put on is for environmental reasons or for health and safety, you are not allowed as a municipality, town, or county to say no to a cell tower based on that. So these issues now are fought legally and typically on zoning features. Most of these have, the towers are having some sort of need for a conditional use permit or a variance. And so 99% of the towers that we deal with are a legal zoning case. So what you just brought up regards to with them filing information on the wrong piece of property, that fits into a zoning and also administrative law category. And this is how we're having these conversations across the country at the zoning and administrative law levels right now, with informing about the health and safety, because you need to know why. Why is this a problem? And health and safety is a big part of that. And you guys muted again here. Can we get somebody to unmute you? My apologies. There we
Yeah,
go.
thanks, Lupin. Yeah.
Okay.
Just telling the folks here that one of the aspects of this we're focused on is the administrative aspect, meaning that we've asked the town to start the process over again, basically, and to do it properly. We found a number of ways that things were being done that we had questions about and serious concerns about. And so even though we know people are doing the best that they can, and we do have sympathy for anybody who volunteers to be a town official, volunteers to serve on a planning board, we also recognize that there are right ways to do things and there are ways to do things that are not right. And so we've held their feet to the fire a little bit with regard to insisting that the process be conducted in a way that's legitimate. So if you have questions about that, feel free to ask any of us who've been involved in this, including me. And then we'll deal with the content, which is whether this is needed. We have evidence to show that it's not needed. And I'm hoping that that's where we can prevail. Other questions?
Yeah.
Ren, did you want to say something?
No, just a question at this point.
Remember to speak into the computer.
Yeah. Thanks again for your time, guys.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Chamberlain, you mentioned the equivalence of danger for cancer and compared it with asbestos. I read an article last week that compared it both with asbestos and lead in severity of cancer risk, and then read that there's a major cancer department that is considering raising the cancer risk from 2B, which is relatively low, up to category 1. So I'm wondering two things. If you would address that issue, if you have any information on it, from strictly a public education point of view. I understand we can't fight it legally, but for public education, the risk of cancer and then how far away from the tower those risks are. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Yes. There, as a result of the National Toxicology Program study on cancer, as a result of the Ramazzini Institute, an Italian organization, in terms of their findings, there's pressure, and it would make total sense if you had a level playing field that it would be raised from a 2B carcinogen to a higher level. But because of pressure by industry, which is extreme, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, it hasn't happened at this point. In fact, there is even pressure to lower its toxicity rating. So, and actually maybe part of the answer too about lead and making that connection between lead and wireless radiation exposure. Those people like me and Pam who have studied this consider that there's no really safe level of exposure. And I'll talk about that in more information in just a moment. But it's just like lead. So lead, they've declared that there's no safe level of exposure, but they've come up with numbers. It's really hard to come up with a number that people agree on as being a reasonable number. And that's something that we fought in the New Hampshire Commission. What's safe and what's reasonable. Reasonable in terms of, you can't say no cell phones. I mean, none of us would go for that. But it would be safe if there was no exposure. So this is a hard question to answer. Pam, I'm going to turn it over to you to maybe add to that while I get some definitive information about how far it's safe to live from a tower. It won't take me long to find those slides. So Pam, do you want to add comment?
And I think Kent's referring to the Brazilian study.
Yes, I am.
So Ren, the analysis about whether to switch the level of carcinogen is in existence, but it's been on hold. It's basically been in existence for 3, 4, 5 years now, maybe a little bit more. And like many things, they talk about making these new determinations and they leave them sit. And I think it's really important for people to know that is actually one of the strategies. You guys are probably old enough to know about the 30-year apologies, where we, have an exposed population and 30 years later, we have an I'm sorry from the President of the United States. This has happened on a number of different occasions. Some of the cell phone law cases of people who've had brain tumors, including, I believe, all of the scientists that worked on and developed the cell phones actually died from brain tumors. And there was a major lawsuit that started 20 years ago and it still has not been heard. So postponing these things, again, is really a part of the tactics of like delaying, as Kent said. It's a predatory delay, and it's unfortunate, but it is a norm that we've established with environmental toxicants in our country. And so we're still dealing with that norm, and I'll hand it back over to Kent.
All right. Perfect timing. Thank you, Pam. So I was asked a specific question about where you should live or where is safe to live near a cell tower. And I have a definitive answer. So I'm going to bring up the slides again that answer that question with clarity. So I'm assuming.
Kent, could I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Of course.
We have about 5 minutes left. We're really appreciative up to the end of what's
I'll do this in 5 minutes,
Okay.
or less than 5 minutes. I'm assuming you can.
Thanks.
I'm assuming you can see my screen now. So I'm assuming you can see it. So in answer to your question, how far away from a tower should you live before it no longer has a great influence on you, on your health? And so this is a study, and again, I've got links to it in where I'm going to send you. So this is part of the appendix to the slide set. And it looks at, so this is a particular study from Brazil that looks at what the death rate is from cancer as a function of how close people were living to a cell tower when they died. And the reason I like this study in particular, it dealt with a large number of people, a large number of cancer deaths, over 7,000, and a large number of cell towers. So in statistics, of course, the holy grail is to get a large number of people so that you have information that's statistically significant. And so let's go right to the data. So what's in red right here is for people who were participating in the study. In other words, people who died. And on the x-axis is how far they were living from a cell tower when they died. And the blue line is the population of the cancer death rate for the population in general. So what you'd expect is you get farther and farther away from a cell tower, your death rate is going to asymptote to the population, the death rate for the population in general. And so the reason I particularly like this study is the large number of people involved, but also it happened between 1996 and 2006. And the reason that's important is we were looking at the effect only of the cell tower. People didn't have, not that many people had their own electronics in that time interval in Brazil. So what we're looking at here is the effect simply of living near a cell tower. The closer you are, and this is 100 meters, 300 feet. And as you get farther and farther away, that drops off. So this suggests a dose-dependent relationship, which is important. And so your question was, at what point, at what distance should you live from a cell tower? We on the commission said, well, if you're 500 meters from a cell tower, that's reasonable. And so that is what I will tell you as an answer. You still are going to get significant exposure at that point. And if you have somebody who's sensitive to electromagnetic fields, they may not feel comfortable at that distance, but it seemed to us on the commission to be a reasonable setback distance from a tower. And so that's it.
And that's 1,642 feet, 500
Yes.
meters, 642 feet.
And that's what we recommend.
Yep. Anything else before we close out today? And who's buying us a beer?
Oh, yeah. Here, hand me a beer, would you? I'm thirsty.
So the answer is 1,500 feet or less.
That's-
1,642 feet or more away.
42. I'll help you measure it off if you need help. I think we're pretty much finished here. Did anyone else want to say anything? Thank you very much to In the Woods. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thanks.
I hope to visit you guys in person one of these days.
We're looking forward to you coming.
Okay,
Yeah.
come on up.
Fantastic.
All
Thank
right,
you.
guys. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.